without your permission. I'd like to thank Richard Hunter. And our next speaker is James Snyder. In 1996, Snyder, formerly deputy director at MoMA, New York's Museum of Modern Art, who grew up in rural southwestern Pennsylvania, was recruited by the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem as its director. 14 years later, with the opening of the museum's acclaimed 100 million campus expansion, he has successfully made the museum Israel's largest cultural institution. Snyder graduated from Harvard in 1973. He studied late 19th century art and literature with focus on John Ruskin and Oscar Wilde. Under his leadership, the museum has raised not only the 100 million for the redesign and expansion, but also 53 million, probably more by now, in a separate endowment campaign. I was there several months ago. I was so impressed. He's here. It's yours.
Perfect. Thank you for the nice words. I can update a little bit of what you described. It's a pleasure to be here. This will be a little bit of a different kind of story. We only have one branch. And it was always the largest cultural institution in Israel. I was asked to talk about the experience of transformational change. In our case, in an institutional setting, not in a business setting, but in many ways they are not dissimilar. I suppose I should also say a bit more about myself. I'm American. Perhaps you can, I'm dressed for the Independence Day party at the American Ambassador's house, which is right after our program just now. Hence the red, white, and blue. But as my Mishneh Lamankal, who's sitting here, Dorlin, can tell you, I am, I don't want to say aggressively American always. I am overtly American at all times. And I'm not sure it's a terrible thing. I did grow up in rural southwestern Pennsylvania in an industrial river town. And I only realized later in life that that actually had an enormous amount to do with what became important for me in my life in understanding and appreciating what's important to people. And it was, in retrospect, that I grew up in a small town in an industrial river valley, but if you turned 10 miles away from the river, you were at a place called Falling Water. And if any of you know about architecture, Falling Water is one of the greatest pieces of modernist architecture set in a natural landscape designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, which was really 10 miles from where I spent my childhood. And I had the privilege to go there as a child, not thinking that that was going to be the guiding force through my life. During my years at MoMA, I had the privilege to be responsible for the expansion of MoMA in 1984, which also produced something called Museum Tower, which is a residential condominium complex that sits on the Museum of Modern Art. It was the first mixed-use cultural development project done in New York City. It was kind of groundbreaking in its time. For me, it was a special privilege. I was quite young when, for some reason, I, among the staff of MoMA, was asked to be responsible for that project. But doing that project made me realize that in the museum world, as in the supermarket world, there are certain ruling criteria. In the case of museums, what makes a museum a strong, powerful cultural place? The first point is site and setting, or location, you can say. Site and setting and architecture, and the combination of architecture and building on architecture, and how that has meaning where you are. The second critical point is quality of material, collections. And the third is commitment of staff, commitment of professionalism. And if you're missing one of those ingredients, you can't do anything. I could name many examples of museums that have so much to offer but are missing one of those critical qualities. The Brooklyn Museum. Has anyone ever been to the Brooklyn Museum? One of you. See, one of us can't speak Hebrew, and one has been to the Brooklyn Museum. The Brooklyn Museum has amazing collections, and it has a really committed staff. But site, setting, and architecture, it's missing big time, no matter what they do there. And no matter what you do to this great place, nothing, alas, will ever be able to happen there. So those were things that percolated through my mind as I kind of grew up as a museum professional. And when I was asked, really, absolutely out of the blue, if I were interested in being director of the Israel Museum, the only thing I knew about it was that it was, at the time, only 31 years old. It was an encyclopedic museum started by Teddy Kollek, whom I had heard of. Didn't know much about him, but I'd heard of him. And I knew that in 31 years, in an encyclopedic museum setting, it had built a collection and a program in modern and contemporary art which was about as good as you could find in any encyclopedic museum in the rest of the world. That is, in a museum not specifically devoted to modern and contemporary art. And so I was intrigued by it, and I came to see the museum, and I stepped onto the campus of the museum, and I saw something that absolutely took my breath away, because for whatever reason, Teddy Kollek, in his enthusiasm, and Teddy was not a person who knew anything about art or art history. He was not a person who really knew about modernist architecture, but somehow Teddy was a genius. Teddy perhaps was the marketing genius of all time in Israel. I always call Teddy the Thomas Jefferson of Israel because he was a visionary, but he was also a marketing genius. He picked the most powerful site in Jerusalem. He picked an amazing hilltop as you enter Jerusalem. Completely through chance, he grabbed three important architectural figures of the mid-20th century. One, a Russian-born, German-trained, sort of Bauhaus-style emigre to Palestine who brought modernist architecture here. One, an Austrian-born American emigre who sort of created the vocabulary of metaphorical modernism or expressionist experiential modernism. And one, a Japanese-born American emigre sculptor of the landscape who might be considered the first environmental sculptor. These three being Al Mansfeld the first, Frederick Kiesler the second, and Isamu Noguchi the third. Three completely different kind of modernists. He brought them to the campus. They, together in 1965, opened a place that planted the seeds of what continues to be the most powerful modernist setting that you could possibly hope to imagine. This image, which you're looking at, is exactly about that. If you look at the top, you see Alfred Mansfeld's sketch of an Arab village on a Jerusalem hilltop, which was his idea for what should be the source matter for a modernist architectural reinterpretation of that village to be a national museum for a new state of Israel. The second drawing you see is his first sketch for how to translate that Arab village into a modernist modular language that could sit on the hilltop, and because Israel was young, could start at a certain size and grow organically as a village might grow, but somehow be a modernist interpretation that could also signal that it was meant to be the repository for the cultural treasures of the state of Israel. The picture at the bottom is what the museum looked like barely 10 years after it opened in 1965. This is a completely rare, if not unique, example of a one-to-one correspondence between a first vision and an architectural reality. Now, I didn't know any of this. All I did in the spring of 1996 was walk up the promenade of the museum. Oh, I have to stop for a moment. Who hasn't been to the Israel Museum? You're all very lucky. I knew none of this, but I saw this incredibly powerful place that spoke to me as having the potential to be the single most powerful cultural setting anywhere in the world. Then I went inside the museum, and I was here incognito, but there was a curator with me, and I was sort of asking him about what the museum held. And it holds 500,000 things. The oldest is 1.5 million years old. The newest was then and continues to be an example of contemporary art of the time from Israel and from around the world. And his message to me was, what we are is many museums under one roof. And what I realized as I walked around that place was, in fact, that we had the potential to be the only museum in the world where you could start at the beginning of material cultural time and come to the present following that trajectory in regional culture here but also wrapping that armature of a trajectory with the material cultures of the rest of the world in Western and non-Western paths. There really is no other museum that does this. You all live in Israel, and everybody always says, even Richard said, the only place that, and everybody always here says, we are the only that. And the answer is it's not always true. In our case, name a museum, and I will tell you why it's not true. The Louvre. The Louvre doesn't begin with prehistoric archaeology. It begins with classical antiquity. And it ends in the 18th century. And then other museums pick up the 19th century and beyond. The Hermitage. The Hermitage Museum starts with prehistory just like us, but the Hermitage actually doesn't deal with contemporary art. The Metropolitan Museum in New York doesn't begin before classical antiquity, but does come to contemporary art. We actually are the only place that starts at the beginning of time, and that could, when I first looked at it, start at the beginning of time and come to the present in a kind of continuum. And I saw that, and I met some of the staff, and we had this amazingly committed staff. The museum then was 31 or 32 years old. Many of the staff had worked there for all of those 31 or 32 years. Some of them had been involved in helping to build the museum in the early 1960s. Everybody had this vivid memory of what the place was. So I thought, in a kind of crazy way, never having been to Israel, not actually knowing exactly where Israel was on the map, except to know that it was in the Eastern Mediterranean, not knowing Hebrew, I called my wife and I said, I feel we should do this. And for some reason she said, why not? So we did come to do this. And you know, I have to tell you that from the first moment of standing on that powerful campus to the present moment, it has always seemed to me that not only was that potential there, but it was realizable. Now, that was 14 years ago, and from the first moment I thought that we might be able to do pretty much exactly what we finished doing and what we inaugurated last July 25th. I'm not sure why or how I knew. Perhaps it was all those years of thinking about those three components of powerfulness in a cultural place. But I also was clever enough, perhaps, to know that you didn't arrive somewhere and immediately just start like a bull in a china shop to make things different. The museum was just beyond its 30th birthday then. There were lots of issues that unfolded. There was this intifada that kind of discouraged anybody who wasn't a Jerusalemite from spending time in Jerusalem. There was a sort of financial circumstance to be stabilized. There was a staff to be brought around from the idea that we were many museums under one roof, and this was what was positive, to the idea that we should be a continuum where all things connected from the beginning to the present, and that was our unique potential for powerful positioning. And we then actually spent the next 8 or 9 years in a way kind of aiming to the museum's 40th anniversary, which occurred in 2005, to a point where all the staff did come around to appreciate that we were a singularly rich collection that did represent this continuum where our message could be about how all things connected, how all things in material cultural time could connect. I don't know if any of you can remember as far back as 2005, but when we turned 40, after a couple of years of thinking, we did a whole year's program which was on the subjects of beauty and sanctity, how objects of beauty could be so beautiful that somehow they seemed holy, and how ritual objects could be so important to ritual practice that they could become imbued with a sense of beauty. And we did a whole series of exhibitions throughout the year which were actually about taking things from different points across the timeline and taking things from different parts of the world, putting them side by side, and seeing how they resonated when that happened. We weren't thinking about it then, but in fact, doing that, getting us to that point, was simply laying the groundwork for doing what we have now completed doing. I hope and trust that you have all been to the museum since last July 25. Is there anyone who's brave enough to say that he or she hasn't? Oh my. Well, you still have 5 weeks to come within the first year since the inaugural of the renewed campus. That is not it. That is the museum as it appears today. Now, if you think to yourselves, gee, that looks like the museum that we knew, that's a very important point. Because what we felt we were doing was not transforming change, but transforming renewal. Because what we felt was that from its very first moment, from Teddy's mind, came this unbelievably strong vision for exactly what we were meant to be. It's just that we hadn't yet fully realized that vision. And I wouldn't have the hubris to suggest that, in fact, we have accomplished that 100%. I would only say that if we were along a trajectory, we've moved a little bit further along that trajectory. What you see here gives us a lot of pride, because what, in fact, it seems to be is the organic extension of the original. We are now 12 times bigger than the original. But what you see here is that strong statement of an Arab village on a Jerusalem hillside, interpreted in a modernist vocabulary, and growing in an organic way as a village might grow. But what you see has been tweaked, we hope, in a very important way. And what you see is something that we accomplished thinking from day one that we should do something that was a little bit counter-trend with respect to what any other museum had ever done before, and certainly counter-trend with respect to what museums worldwide have been doing in the last 20 years, and certainly something that might be different from any other cultural development project that had ever been done in Israel. I mean this in the few following ways. First of all, when museums in the last 20 years worldwide have decided to transform, it has generally meant tearing everything down, starting from scratch, hiring Frank Gehry or another signature architect, and reinventing themselves. As I've said, we felt committed to an original vision, and we felt that that was not what we should do, and it was not what we were about. So that was point one. We felt that we should do a transforming renewal, and it should be about subordinating an ego and a vision to the burning power of the original, and our purpose should be to bring out the original in the best possible form physically. So the first thing we decided to do was to hire an architect who wasn't a named signature architect, a star architect. We decided to hire an architect who would be mandated to work with the geometry and the ethos of the original and to subordinate his own ego to that original, and yet to take on the assignment of creating a language which would make a signature for himself as an architect and as a statement for the museum of renewal. That was point one. Point two was that we're pretty big. We sit on a 20-acre site. We had 500,000 square feet of built area. We had a certain envelope that we felt was precious in the vision that you see here. And we felt that all that needed to be preserved. We wanted to grow the presence of the galleries of the museum. We wanted to grow the strength of the statement of presentation of collections. In fact, we wanted to double the collection galleries of the museum, but we didn't want to grow the museum. So what we asked the architect to do was to pull everything out of the pre-existing envelope, move to the front of the campus on the footprint of pre-existing but not very good architecture, everything having to do with entry, service, and movement to the heart of the campus, so that we could re-engineer within our envelope and create gallery space where it had not existed. Thirdly, we decided that we should spend $100 million. No museum redevelopment project anywhere in the world has cost less than $500 million in the last 20 years. And we simply said that we're in Israel, we need to be about modesty, and we can spend $100 million and not a penny more. Finally, we realized that we said we're not building new buildings, we are renewing a campus. And when we went about fundraising for that $100 million, we felt that it shouldn't be about a kind of piecemeal assemblage of big gifts in order to name buildings, because we had our buildings. We felt that we needed to undertake a collective initiative that would be about communal gifts to renew a pre-existing campus. All of this was something not ever done before. And finally, and the biggest point, was that the main objective of what we were doing needed to be about the representation, the reinterpretation and representation of content. And that is what we set about doing. So our project enabled us to strengthen, in a funny way, this profile that you're looking at is a profile that, as I said, was there on day one, but in a funny way, we've kind of brought out more of that original burning vision in what you see. Inside, we've been able to double the space available for collection galleries from 100,000 feet to 200,000 feet without changing the envelope or footprint of the museum. So we don't seem to be bigger than we were. We've reduced the number of objects on display. You know, when you read about museums, it's always what's the size of your collection, what's the percentage of your collection that's on view. This is not relevant. The point is, what objects in your collection can tell a narrative that you want to tell. So we used to show 10,000 objects in 100,000 feet. Now we show 7,000 objects in 200,000 square feet. And if you've been to the museum or if you've read anything about what we've done, what gives us pride is to appreciate how what is appreciated is the sense of ambiance that the museum now has. And this is something which actually makes us feel very good. We also decided that, unlike a lot of institutional projects in Israel, we should raise the money before we began, and we should compress as much as possible the planning period and the execution period, because we felt and still feel that we're quite important, certainly to our audience in Jerusalem and certainly as a cultural statement from Israel, and we felt that we should do everything as quickly as possible to minimize the disruption to the campus. We wanted to stay open throughout the period of the project, and we managed, therefore, to raise $100 million in 18 months from 19 different sources, none of whom would be recognized with a name on a building, all of whom would be recognized as you enter the campus on a single, very elegant sign that says, in the year 2010, the Israel Museum campus was renewed through the generosity of a bunch of $5 and $10 million gifts that collectively funded the renewal of the museum. We raised the money before we started. We spent 30 months planning, and then we spent 30 months executing from the beginning of 2008 until July 25th, 2010, when we inaugurated the renewed campus. When we started our work, we announced our opening date. We kept to that opening date. We said we would spend $100 million, and we spent $100 million. And we did all of this during this crazy period. You remember the fall of 2008, when everything changed in the world, and suddenly, for the first time in history, the shekel was a hugely valuable currency, more valuable than the dollar. We started then, and nonetheless managed to do all of the above. In a way, luck was with us. The idea that you should have 19 donors, not one donor, sort of spread a risk, but it didn't matter because everybody stayed in the picture, everybody paid up on time. Secondly, because of what happened in the world, the sort of museum production world drew to a standstill. We were the only active museum project in that 2.5 years. So any supplier, designer, source, or specialized manufacturer that we might want to use was available to us because we were the only game in town. At the same time, as you know, the shekel grew alarmingly strong during that period. I think we budgeted our project at 4.3 shekels to $1. We finished our project at 3.5, which means we really didn't have $100 million, but we still came in with $100 million. We finished our project and opened last July. We have had an amazing amount of only positive coverage from all over the world. Any major world publication that you might name one. We have had great coverage, generally front page coverage, even from places that are really hostile about Israel, haven't been hostile about us. We are just finishing the 11th month of full operations, and we have had over 860,000 people in the museum since July 26th, 2010. We will certainly get over 900,000, and if all of you would come a lot in the next 5 weeks, we might just get over 1 million people in this period. The response in the professional community has been completely gratifying because of this idea that we simply took a completely alternative approach and happened to do it in a period of economic change in the institutional and philanthropic worlds, where what we did just might have to be the wave of the future. because you can't afford to do the alternative to what we did. As the one who, for whatever reason, saw this on a day one without knowing very much about anything, it's been a little bit unnerving to see it realized. But beyond that, I actually would say that it's been rather gratifying to observe the appreciation for it, not just from around the world, because I think one might expect that for a cultural accomplishment in the international landscape, but locally. I mean, I really shouldn't talk about people in Israel because I'm not Israeli. I'm from another planet. But we all know that often the eye here looks elsewhere before it looks here. Often I would say to people generally from down here on the coast, when were you last at the museum? Oh, I don't know, 15 years ago. When were you last at the Louvre? Oh, last month. It seemed much easier to go to Ben Gurion, fly to Paris and go to the Louvre than to drive up the hill to see a very important exhibition at the Israel Museum. I will tell you that among the 850 or 60,000 people in this last 11 months, half are tourists. Out of, what do we get in Israel? 2 or 2.5 million tourists a year. Of the other half are Jerusalemites who know and love us. The other half are Israelis from all over Israel, and they seem to come filled with pride for our accomplishment, mostly because we were on time and on budget. And then I stamp my feet and I say, but it's about content. And then they say, yes, also that. And it's actually really a very, very fine thing. Folks from Tel Aviv, the city for which your university is named, who would never come to Jerusalem, now have a habit of coming on Thursday. Oh, they're all on their way there now. They're on their way to stay overnight at the Mamilla Hotel. They're going to have dinner at the Machne Yehuda restaurant. They're going to spend the whole morning at the Israel Museum. Then they rush down the hill to Abu Ghosh, eat lunch, and come home. That never happened before. And that really has become quite a meaningful thing for us because it means that there's been a kind of awakening. So I'm happy to answer a question, and that's the end of the story. Yes. It's a really good question. When I first got here, I didn't think very much about Israeli art. In 1998, when Israel turned 50, we started to see a change. It was a couple of things. One is, you all are big on technology. And two things happened. The world started to get focused on digitally manipulated photography, and video became a hugely important art form. And suddenly it seemed that artists in Israel had a facility with those mediums that artists in the rest of the world didn't quite have in the same way. Also, once Israel turned 50, there's something that happens after 50. You get to disconnect from the first moment, and you can be a little less self-serious and a little more humorous about yourself. And it allowed Israeli art to kind of open up and lighten up. And from 1998 until today, artists in Israel have developed in an amazing way, actually. If you look at who are the most sort of lightning rod recognized artists working worldwide, a lot of them are Israeli artists working in Israel or working in the rest of the world. A lot of them are practitioners in video and in photography, mostly digitally manipulated photography. And it's actually quite an important development. And I would have said before that Israel wasn't so high on the totem pole, and I would say now that it is. And there's quite a lot of attention and recognition. No, well, yes, no. I think there's a facility here for technology. And, video as an early medium was not so interesting, too much equipment. But once you had a plasma screen, it opened a whole new universe. And artists from here seem to be able to work with that extremely well. And, when you look back 100 years from now at the medium of this moment, of this quarter century, like once it was oil painting, now it's video. And I think when you look at video production in this period, and when they look back at who the great artists were, among the top 50 will be a fair number of Israeli artists.
like to thank the two speakers. I was one of those who spent 2 months there in 1963 working, laying bricks when I was in high school. It's a marvelous place. He may be not objective, but I'm objective. A marvelous place. Go and see there and help him get to 1 million by July 25th. Thank you very much. You want to say something to him?
We raised all of our own money. The state had committed early on to give us, it's a crazy thing here. Cultural institutions are not tax exempt. We pay VAT on everything that we do. So the government, in effect, agreed to return VAT. So that was 16 or 17% of the $100 million. The rest we raised from 19 sources, mostly worldwide. $5 million came from private sources in Israel because one of our American donors required a match in Israel. So it was actually a great thing. It stimulated $5 million that wouldn't have happened, and it let Israel be a shareholder in what we were accomplishing. But basically, we did everything we did within a pre-existing envelope, so more or less without requiring any approvals for changes in the zoning or use of our site or our buildings. And really, in a funny way, it's a funny kind of thing. It's a two-edged sword. And you could look at Habima, which I'm certainly not qualified to speak about, and look at us. We were left to our own devices. And maybe we were mad people, but if we had gone wrong, we would have been allowed to go wrong. Fortunately, we went right, and in great part because a very good hand was guiding us. And that's it. As I say, I'm sort of not joking. In a way, we're not the State of Israel. We're the State of the Israel Museum. And it's not a terrible thing. We are, in effect, a private institution. De facto, we're the National Museum. We get a little bit of money from the government, but it's a discretionary annual grant, and it was a discretionary commitment for the equivalent of VAT. But otherwise, we operate as, in America, a 501c3, which is a private, nonprofit, tax-exempt organization. And it gave us the latitude to do all this. But I have to say, we might be madmen, but we've got a lot of people who are our shareholders. We have a board. We have 14 organizations around the world that support us through an international council. They have leadership. Each of those guys was with us all along this process at every stage, kind of helping, supporting, guiding, and being a check and balance system. But again, it was kind of our own self-created check and balance system. So I can't say everyone should do it the way that we did it, but I don't think it's a bad way to do it.
Again, I thank the two speakers and have a good day. Bye.